Man, we've been waiting a long time, and I do mean all of us. Retail Cardano holders, traders, investors, whales, stake pool operators, dApp developers. We've all been hodling and waiting for that era when all the Cardano tools have exited the laboratory and are laid bare on the table, glistening in the light of day. We need those three SIPs. We need pipelining. We need those bigger blocks. And it looks like all those things will be in hand in just a couple of months. Ready?
Let's go.
Big thanks to Had Aloha for the Barack Obama deepfake Let's Go. Today, we're going to discuss the mid-month update and all the Vasil hard fork combinator news. People sounding the alarm, not in a good way, on two new projects, a new JavaScript framework for off-chain code, and Charles offering to help someone you might know. If you're an enthusiast of Swiss Army knives on leaves, or if you're getting value out of these videos, I would love it if you would consider delegating to the Army of Spies stakepool ticker AOS. This mid-month update had all the news on everything that's happening in the Vasil Hard Fork Combinator event in June and a good explanation of why those things are actually important. It also contained the most perfect and concise explanation of basically everything in Plutus ever. Today was only a double H. We had Harrison and Hammond, no Hemsley, no Nigel Hemsley. He's taking some downtime. I'm super delighted to hear that these guys are actually able to take time off given how much they're getting done. First up was John Woods with some updates on the status of the network. He said either load has dropped or the network has just been scaled really well given all the things they've done. He said we're at a 2 to 2.3 second propagation time to 95% of the network. You'll remember that John said we had a 5-second budget when he first came on board. So we're less than halfway there. Things are going great. Currently, there's no backlog whatsoever, and dApps are running great. In short, the chain is already in a pretty good place as far as throughput goes, and that's before all the things we're going to talk about. Kevin Hammond reported that 69% of stake pool operators have already upgraded to node 1.34.1, which is probably why we're seeing this great performance of the network as reported by John. He said soon they'll be on to version 1.35. John reminded us once again that we've already upped block size from 64 kilobytes to 80 KB, memory units from 10 million to 14 million, and block level limits from 50 million to 62 million. But they're not done. Next epic, block size will go to 88 KB. So we're currently at 80. It's going to go up to 88 KB. That's another 10% real layer 1 throughput increase. This is a pretty big deal. In other blockchains, increasing the layer 1, the base layer throughput by 10% would be something they would probably, talk about and advertise for like months. In Cardano, it's something we're just casually doing in the next 5 days. Here's some important news. They are now code complete for everything that'll be in the Vasil Hard Fork Combinator in June. This includes some big pieces like SIPs 31 through 33 plus pipelining. Those items will all lay the groundwork for input endorsers, which will come later. But it's important to remember that these things are tools, badly needed tools, but still just tools. They're not like magic viruses that kind of infect all of the smart contracts underlying all the dApps and automatically make the dApps run faster and do new things. Instead, these are things, reference scripts, reference inputs, and inline datums. The things from SIPs 31 through 33. These are things that the dApp developers are going to have to proactively build into their dApps. They're going to have to build their dApps, build out new code to use these new tools. I know you're thinking, code complete? Doesn't that mean they're done? If they're complete, if they're done, why don't we just have this Vasil Hard Fork Combinator event tomorrow? So it turns out between now and June, they will be doing deep QA just to make sure there won't be any problems. There will also be a test net. Obviously, the test net is going to be important if we just said that the dApp developers are going to have to build out new things in their dApp to make use of these new tools. Next up, John gave us an excellent primer on the fundamentals of Plutus. And when I say excellent primer, I mean this was the most concise, easiest to understand, straightforward explanation of all the fundamentals of Plutus that you would ever want to hear. If John Woods taught at Erie University, his class would have been the one you actually like to attend. First, he took us through what he calls the heart of EUTXO. These are 4 elements, including contracts, the redeemer, the datum, and the context. The contract is basically the script that locks a UTXO, what we commonly refer to as a smart contract. The redeemer is data passed from the user to the smart contract. The datum is basically state associated with the UTXO. We've talked a lot about local state versus global state, like in Ethereum. This is that local state. Context is metadata pertaining to a transaction. Those aren't exact definitions, but just real quick to give you an idea. Then he took us through Plutus architecture from dApp source code in Haskell to the compiler pipeline where the code will be refined for efficiency. And this is made up of a number of steps. This diagram here kind of runs you through some of those steps, but basically we don't want to run the Haskell code on chain. We want to run it through the compiler pipeline to refine it to make it more efficient to run on chain. The first step is Plutus IR. This is Plutus intermediate representation, which allows for modification and molding of the source code for optimization. Then the next step is typed Plutus core, which is further refined, but still has some extra info that devs can use for debugging. Step number 3 is untyped Plutus core. This is basically just a type of lambda calculus. Longtime listeners of this channel will remember me talking about learning lambda calculus last year. In my quest to go through the Haskell book, which you can find at thehaskellbook.com, you can purchase it there. It's a giant, I forget how many pages, like 1,200 page Haskell book. And I think it's the second chapter. I think they spend one chapter explaining to you why on earth you would ever want to learn Haskell. And this is pretty self-explanatory if you're involved in Cardano, but if you're not, they kind of have to lay out for you why you should actually learn Haskell. The second, if I remember correctly, and I could be misremembering, but the second chapter is just lambda calculus, which sounds like it's going to be super complicated. You're thinking like, okay, calculus was really hard. When I took calculus, it was really hard. I don't want to learn a different type of calculus. It's not like that. If you took algebra, if you understand the very basic concepts of algebra, you can definitely learn lambda calculus. I'm no kind of math genius, and I went through the chapter in this book, and before I went through the chapter, I didn't really understand what functional programming even was. After I went through the chapter on lambda calculus, I instantly understood at least what functional programming was. I was definitely no kind of functional programmer, but at least I understood what functional programming was and conceptually where it came from. I think it's actually worth your time. If you have any tiny percentage of you that's curious about the concepts in lambda calculus, I think it's probably worth your time. I don't know if the haskellbook.com is the best way to learn lambda calculus, but going through that chapter was really valuable to me. Once we have this untyped Plutus core, which is just a version of lambda calculus, that's what actually gets executed on chain. It gets on chain through toolkits and other Plutus tools. This is where John took a little bit of a sidestep and had to explain something. We've been talking a lot about functional programming over the last few minutes. And functional programming obviously involves functions, which requires inputs. And it's off-chain code, which allows for transaction generation so that we can make inputs into these dApps. These inputs could be things like redeemers and datums. Going back to our diagram, after going through the compiler pipeline, we next end up with Plutus core scripts, which are injected into the blockchain via Plutus tools. The on-chain scripts are then processed by the Plutus Ledger API and finally executed and run by the Plutus core evaluator. Next, he talked about Plutus contract interaction. How do we actually interact with these Plutus contracts? So the situation's about to change. He said, right now it looks like this. You write on-chain code, you compile it, you generate the transaction, you sign the transaction with your private key, and you submit the transaction to be run on the chain. But here's the interesting piece. Plutus scripts don't go on the chain until you're interacting with them. You submit them along with your transaction each time you want to interact with them. This isn't perfect because I said you submit them each time you want to interact with them. You don't submit them once and then interact with them as many times as you want. You have to submit them each time you want to interact with them. Obviously, if you've been paying attention to this channel, you know where this is going. CIPs 31 through 33, which change all that. Reference inputs, which is CIP 31, you won't have to consume and recreate a UTXO anymore to use a datum as an input. So we want to use datums. We probably want to use them repetitively. But right now, in order to use a datum, we have to consume the UTXO and recreate it. With reference inputs in CIP 31, you can just read that input, which is the datum. You can just read that input without consuming the UTXO. Inline datums are CIP 32. You can store a datum directly on chain with CIP 32 instead of dealing with a hash of the datum. Currently, it has to be a hash of the datum. Inline datum CIP 32 makes it so that you can store a datum directly on chain. And then the big one, CIP 33 reference scripts. Instead of having to submit this script every time you want to use it along with your transaction with reference scripts CIP 33, you can just refer to on-chain pre-recorded scripts from other transactions instead of including the script repetitively every time you want to use it. They're also bringing in built-in support for other cryptographic elliptic curve signature schemes so that you can easily interact with signatures from other blockchains like Bitcoin and Ethereum. Then John described how Cardano basically forms a directed acyclic graph, a DAG. I did 2 videos last year on how DAGs work. Check out the second one if you're curious. It was Cardano Rumor Rundown number 41 in April of last year. The important part is that DAGs allow for massive parallel processing, which Cardano will have. John also went over contention and concurrency, which are things we talked about a lot last year. And we know from that huge discussion that multiple UTXOs are a great solution to contention to allow for concurrency. John added that this also allows you to exploit UTXO's massive parallelism. Reference inputs will obviously make this even easier since a single UTXO can be referenced repeatedly without actually having to spend it. So you can see from this diagram, we've got a couple different things going on. If you want multiple parties to actually be able to spend a UTXO, you use multiple UTXOs. But if you just want them to have read-only access, just be able to get at that datum and use that datum as an input, you can just use reference inputs, CIP 31. Next up, it's great that we finally now have an EVM sidechain. It's also not great in the sense that it's very easy for anyone to copy any of the popular DeFi platforms in the EVM world that are available that have code that's publicly accessible. It's easy to take that code and deploy it over on the EVM sidechain. Here, Nico Arqueros, who is the CEO of DC Spark and knows a thing or two about Milkomeda, he's letting you know, be really careful of these two platforms, Milko Farm and Milky Cow. He says, I personally wouldn't put a single ADA there. You can see other people down here. This poster says, yep, low effort pancake swap clones. So we've got to be careful. Now that we have an EVM sidechain, the chances of you accidentally letting your little ADA lobsters crawl into what looks like a nice lobster cave and turns out to be a lobster trap are much higher. It's much higher that you accidentally deposit your assets into a lobster trap. So you've got to be super careful. There should be more to your decision about whether to deposit your ADA somewhere than just the displayed rate of return. because the rate of return is zero if you get scammed. And obviously, we don't know what projects. I don't know anything about these two projects. I'm not saying anything bad or good about them. I just don't know. But people are sounding the alarm about some of these projects that seem like a place where you should be very careful. And there's going to be a lot of this. And there will be lobster traps, and the chance of this happening to you is much higher if you are just recklessly depositing your assets in anything that pops up, especially if it's some kind of EVM based platform. Be careful. The robbery forest is a thing. How many MVP trophies are we going to have to give Alessandro? This dude created the Berry NFTs, the Berry Pool, Space Buds. He pioneered NFT distribution in Cardano. He pioneered smart contract NFT marketplaces in Cardano. He's responsible for the Nami wallet. Now he's built a framework for handling Plutus off-chain code in JavaScript. I don't know if this dude likes Red Bulls, some other type of energy drink, some food. Like, I don't know if we need to send him pizzas, whatever he needs to keep doing exactly what he's doing. I say we just send him 10,000 cases of it, whether it's some kind of drink or food, cigarettes, whatever it is. Let's send him all of them. Finally, Charles is offering to help Elon Musk. He says, Elon, if Twitter rejects your offer, then hit me up. Happy to build a decentralized one. You're probably aware Elon has offered to acquire Twitter and take it private so that he can solve the perceived freedom of speech problems. I know listeners of this channel are probably all over the board on this question of free speech on social media. We won't dive into all those arguments right now, but I thought it was interesting. And I like the fact that Charles is always offering to help out with these kind of things. And down here, we had a very interesting comment from Bryant Austin, who listens to this channel. He says, hey, he points out that first principles has been a pretty successful approach for Tesla, and buying General Motors probably would not have been a great way to start the process of building a Tesla. Instead, you just build a Tesla. He says, first principles, buying Twitter is not a first principles approach to solving this problem. I predict Cardano will be the leader in this field with Atala Prism. This is kind of interesting. I do kind of wonder, if you bought a Twitter and tried to fix it, do you really end up with something better than just building something from the ground up? Obviously, you've got an audience, you've got a built-in audience for Twitter, but then again, that same argument would have applied to trying to build a Tesla by buying General Motors. I hope everybody is getting ready for a fantastic weekend. It's springtime in much of the world, so I hope you got fun things planned, and I will talk to you soon.